Brian Whitaker had always started his mornings the same way. A fresh cup of black coffee, a slow walk down to the dock, and a quiet moment beside the lake before the neighborhood stirred to life. The gentle lapping of the water against the dock, the scent of pine drifting from the nearby forest, and the proud sight of his boat resting in its slip. It was the reason he bought the place. But this morning was different. The coffee was still warm in his hand when he noticed something off. He stood at the edge of the dock, brows furrowed, trying to register what was missing. Then it hit him. The boat was gone. His custom-built base boat, the same one he'd spent 5 years saving for and 6 months modifying with a high-torque trolling motor and a sonar system, had vanished. Not drifted, not unmoored, vanished. The mooring rope had been sliced clean. The cleats were still intact, and worse, the chain lock had been cut. Brian's heart began to pound, not just with anger, but disbelief. This was a private lake inside a gated HOA community. Security cameras lined the roads. Neighbors rarely even left their garage doors open, and yet someone had the audacity to steal a boat that barely even fit through the lake's narrow exit channel. He turned around and headed back toward the house, ready to check the footage from his Ring cameras. That's when he heard the faint hum of an electric car approaching from the trail near the pines, and there she was, Karen Prescott, HOA president, neighborhood perfectionist, legendary for sending emails about grass height and holiday flags. Being 1 inch too low, Karen wore her signature visor and a pastel windbreaker. She pulled up with a practiced smile and a wicker basket resting on her lap, filled with muffins. "Well, good morning, Brian," she said, stepping off the cart like a politician visiting a new district. "I heard some unfortunate news." "Your boat, wasn't it?" Brian stared at her. She wasn't supposed to know yet. "I was just about to check my cameras," he said slowly. "Did someone call you already?" Karen chuckled. "Oh no, dear. I was out for a walk. Saw your slip was empty. Figured something was wrong." That answer didn't sit right. The slip wasn't visible from the walking trail. Before he could say anything, she held up a form on a clipboard. "By the way, I was reviewing some paperwork," she said. "Did you ever complete the HOA's watercraft compliance form? All vessels must be registered to remain in the community." Brian stared at the paper. "I've had that boat here for 2 years, yes," she said, her smile tightening. "But the new policy was passed 3 weeks ago. Page 43 of the handbook, addendum. Didn't you get the memo?" He hadn't. And now, this conversation was raising more red flags than he could count. As Karen handed him the form and cheerfully offered him a muffin, Brian noticed something else: her nails. They were freshly painted, but stained slightly along the tips. Fiberglass dust, boat paint. Before he could respond, she glanced at her phone, muttered something about needing to call her son, and turned away. Brian watched her disappear round the bend, the hum of her car fading into the trees. He didn't know exactly what was going on yet, but he could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just a missing boat. This was something bigger. And if he didn't figure it out fast, someone else might start rewriting the truth before he could prove anything. Brian didn't sleep that night. After Karen's mysterious visit, he spent hours reviewing footage from every camera around his home. The front porch, the backyard, even the one angled toward the lake. At 2:46 a.m., he spotted faint movement on the dock. The figure wore a hoodie, moved with confidence, and carried bolt cutters. But the camera caught only the back of the head, blonde hair poking from under the hood. It was too dark for a clear ID, no license plate. No help from the neighborhood gates either. The HOA controlled cameras, conveniently, were under maintenance this week. Brian's requests for access have been met with radio silence. At sunrise, he drove the perimeter of the lake, searching for anything unusual. But it wasn't until late afternoon that his phone buzzed with a message from his neighbor Tina. The photo she sent nearly made him drop his phone. Across the lake, barely visible through the trees, was his boat, his boot, sitting at the end of another dock. The details were unmistakable. The red hull stripe, the custom rail, and the warm leather captain's seat he'd never replaced. And standing on deck was a man Brian had seen before, tall, tan, mid-20s, flipping a beer into the water like it was his. Chase Prescott, Karen's son. Brian felt the heat rise in his chest. Chase didn't even live in the neighborhood. He was only seen during summer breaks, always in trouble, and somehow always forgiven. His mother had made excuses for him at HOA meetings for years. Boys will be boys, she said. He's just spirited. Apparently, spirited enough to steal a boat. Brian didn't call the police. Not yet. He drove across the lake, parked houses down from the Prescott residence, and walked the rest of the way. The party sounds got louder as he approached. Laughter, music hut, the clang of glass bottles. At the dock, there were 3 people on board. Chase was in the captain's seat, acting like a man with a mortgage and a boat loan. 2 girls lounged nearby, sipping drinks like this was a college frat lakefront. Brian stopped a few feet from the dock, arms crossed. Chase looked up. "Oh," Chase said, squinting. "You the guy from across the lake? You know exactly who I am," Brian replied. Chase smirked, lifting his drink. "Sweet ride? Ha, that boat is mine." Chase leaned back, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "You people are so territorial. Mom said you weren't even using it anymore. Said it was going to rot on your dock. She said I could take it for the summer." Brian stared. "She said you could take it. She gifted it to me," Chase replied. "She runs the HOA. Said the boat wasn't compliant, so technically it was, like, impounded." Brian took a slow step forward. "That's not how impoundment works," Chase shrugged. "Take it up with her. But I'm not giving it back. And if you touch it, I'll have you arrested for harassment." Brian clenched his fists. He wasn't a man who lost his temper. But right now, he was tempted. Before another word was exchanged, the sound of flip-flops slapped the dock behind them. Karen appeared, winded, holding her phone up like it was a badge. "There he is," she panted, pointing to Brian. "That's him. He's harassing my son. He followed him here. He's unstable." Brian blinked. "What are you?" Karen turned away and spoke into her phone. "Yes, 911. I'd like to report a disturbance. A man is threatening my son. He's making violent gestures and trespassing." Brian stood in silence as her voice rose, panic and loud, more performance than truth. In the background, Chase leaned casually on the boat's railing, watching the chaos unfold like it was entertainment. Brian looked around. Neighbors were stepping onto their porches. Some were filming. Others just watched. But one thing was clear: the story was already being rewritten. And if he didn't find proof soon, the entire neighborhood might believe the version Karen was selling. The deputy who arrived was young, likely new to the force, and clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He listened to both sides, notebook in hand, occasionally glancing toward the still partying guests on the boat behind Karen and her son. Brian laid it out calmly. It was his boat, legally owned and registered, taken without permission. Karen, meanwhile, spoke with the breathless urgency of someone narrating a thriller novel. She gestured wildly toward Brian, accused him of aggression, and kept repeating the word unstable like it was part of her daily vocabulary. The deputy eventually asked one question that made both of them pause. "Do you have paperwork proving you gave him the boat, ma'am?" Karen blinked. "Well, I mean, I didn't give it to him in writing. I informed him the HOA would be seizing the non-compliant watercraft. He assumed. That's not the same as a legal transfer." Brian cut in. The deputy nodded. "This sounds like a civil matter, not criminal. But I'd advise you both to avoid further contact until you sort it out. You can pursue legal channels." Karen's jaw clenched. She wasn't used to not getting her way. Brian walked back to his truck in silence. No rest, no justice, not yet. But at least now. The deputy had seen the chaos firsthand. Still, Brian knew that wouldn't be enough. Karen had influence, Chase had arrogance, and if this went on much longer, people would forget who really owned the truth. That night, Brian pulled out his HOA welcome packet, contracts, and bylaws. He scoured every document for anything Karen might have used to justify her twisted logic. Tucked inside an envelope was an updated rules sheet, timestamped just 2 months ago. Section 8, Clause 14. All watercraft must be registered with the HOA compliance officer or be considered abandoned property after 90 days. He hadn't seen that before. At the bottom of the sheet were 3 signatures: Karen Prescott, HOA President; Melanie Griggs, Compliance Officer. And this one made his eyes narrow. Brian Whitaker, listed as acknowledged by. His stomach turned. He had never signed this paper. Not once. The signature looked close to his, but the swoop of the W was slightly wrong, and the ink tone was off. Someone had forged it. He wasn't going to accuse Karen outright, not without evidence, but it was enough to push him to dig deeper. He opened his old laptop and logged into the HOA Digital Archiver password-protected page the board members had access to. Years ago, Karen had accidentally sent him a link meant for someone else. He'd saved it just in case. It still worked. Inside the archive were scans of every compliance report, every rule change, and every board vote. He scrolled through the latest files. The watercraft clause had passed with 2 votes, Karen's and Melanie's. That's when he found something else: a scanned form labeled watercraft violation. Lot 17. His lot. The violation was filled out 2 weeks before his boat had gone missing. Photos were attached, only they weren't of his boat parked on his dock. They were of it supposedly tied up near the Prescott property. With a timestamp that didn't match, he checked the metadata. It had been digitally altered. Brian exhaled slowly. That was the proof he needed. He took screenshots of everything: timestamps, metadata, the altered signature, the mismatched photos. He backed them up on a USB drive and sent copies to his lawyer. The next morning, he received an email from the HOA board. It was short, sterile, and full of passive language. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, we regret to inform you that due to multiple compliance violations, including failure to register personal watercraft, the HOA has reassigned the abandoned vessel on your lot to a resident in good standing. The board considers the matter closed. Sincerely, the Greenbend Lakefront HOA." He read it twice. Then a third time. They weren't backing down. They weren't even pretending to be fair anymore. As Brian sat at his kitchen table, staring at the cold wording on the screen, a new thought crossed his mind. Karen wasn't acting alone. This wasn't just a power trip. It was a cover-up, and someone on that board had just signed their name to it. Brian wasn't a fan of public scenes. He preferred facts, calm discussions, and letting the truth speak louder than emotion. But this time, the HOA had left him no choice. The official email declaring his boat abandoned was a slap in the face, not just to him but to common sense. That line about reassigned to a resident in good standing said everything. Chase, a man who didn't even live full-time in the neighborhood, was apparently more in good standing than the homeowner whose property backed up to the water. Brian couldn't fight the board from inside their closed doors. Not yet, but he had another way through the very people the HOA depended on for their illusion of control. The residents. He started with Bob. Bob Livingston was the closest thing Green Bend Lakefront had to a town crier. The man knew everyone's business, and repeated it twice before lunch. More importantly, he hated being left out of anything big. Brian invited him over under the pretense of needing help with a leaking garden hose attachment. Within minutes, Bob was seated on the patio with a cold drink and eyes full of curiosity. "So," Bob said, leaning back, "what's this really about?" Word's been traveling faster than Chase's beer runs. Brian didn't waste time. He showed him the forged documents, the altered timestamps, the backdated violation, and even a screen recording of the HOA archive he wasn't technically supposed to access. Bob stared at the laptop for a full minute, blinking slowly. "She forged your signature," he said finally. "You can go to prison for that." Brian nodded. "She will if I can get this in front of people who matter." Bob looked up. "Oh, people will care, all right. Especially after the fireworks she set off last July. This place is a powder keg, and Karen's been lighting matches." By sundown, Bob had already made a few strategic stops. The Donovans on Birch Hill, who'd been fined for their mailbox being a quarter-inch too tall. The Ryans, who were banned from flying their military flag on certain holidays. And the Turners, whose autistic son was once penalized for leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk. All of them had bones to pick with Karen. The very next day, Brian posted an open letter on the neighborhood forum. No accusations, just questions. Does the HOA have the right to seize property without direct contact? Should board members be allowed to give abandoned property to family members? Would the community be okay with forged signatures and tampered documents as standard procedure? He attached nothing, no evidence, just enough to spark a tandem meeting. That weekend, the community clubhouse was packed. Karen arrived late, flanked by Melanie Griggs and a few loyal members of the board. Chase, wearing mirrored sunglasses indoors, strolled behind her like a smug celebrity. The air was thick with tension. Karen stepped up to the podium. Her tone was falsely sweet, and her voice carried just enough forced humility to make seasoned actors jealous. "We've had some unfortunate misunderstandings lately," she began, "and I think it's important that we clear the air. The HOA has always acted with integrity." Then explain this. Brian stood from the third row, holding up a manila folder. Karen froze. She hadn't expected a confrontation this early. "This," he continued, walking toward the front, "is the original registration of my boat, the video of it being taken, and the forged compliance form filed under my name. Also included is proof Chase doesn't meet residency requirements to claim reassignment." The room went silent. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. Brian placed the folder on a table beside the podium, looked Karen dead in the eye, and added calmly, "You want transparency? Let's put it all out in the open." Karen's lips tightened. "You had no right to access private HOA records." Brian turned to the crowd. "No one had the right to steal my property and forge my signature. But it happened, and it's all right there." She stood. But a few neighbors were already murmuring. Cell phones lit up. Someone near the back muttered, "That explains my patio fine last month." Karen's grip on the room was loosening. She could feel it. Brian didn't gloat. He just walked back to his seat. The damage was already done. The residents were awake now, and once suspicion started spreading through an HOA, it moved like wildfire. What Karen didn't know was that the most explosive piece of evidence hadn't even been revealed yet, because buried inside the documents Brian recovered was a transfer receipt, one Karen signed with Chase's name twice, and the account it came from didn't belong to her at all. The clubhouse meeting had set the fire. Now it was time for the explosion. By Monday morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Sidewalk conversations, text threads, even backyard barbecues centered around the same question. Had Karen really forged signatures, manipulated policies, and handed off someone else's boat to her son? Karen did what Karen always did. She doubled down. She sent out a community-wide email under the subject line clarifying the truth. In it, she denied any wrongdoing, blamed misinformation campaigns, and warned residents not to spread unsubstantiated rumors. She cited her decades of leadership and included a 4-paragraph summary of her HOA volunteer achievements. But the walls were closing in. What Karen didn't know was that Brian had finally gotten what he needed: hard proof that Chase wasn't just handed the boat, he was handed it using HOA funds, tucked inside the digital HOA archive, buried in an unmarked folder labeled Community Allocations Q1. Brian had found a scanned check image. It wasn't addressed to him or to the HOA. It was made out to Prescott Marine Storage, a small-time boat service run by none other than Chase himself. The check had a memo, Boat Compliance Adjustment Transfer Fee. It was signed by Karen, and it was pulled directly from the HOA's emergency maintenance account. Brian's lawyer couldn't believe it either. She used HOA money to pay her own son for taking your boat, he said over the phone. That's not just unethical, that's misappropriation. It was time to take this past the neighborhood. That Wednesday, Brian filed a formal report with the County Fraud Investigation Office. Then he contacted a local reporter who previously covered a scandal involving a crooked HOA. Born in a neighboring town, she called him back the same evening. By Friday, a crew showed up at Brian's front porch with cameras. He didn't gloat. He told his story calmly, clearly, with documents in hand. He mentioned no names directly, but the message was obvious. The news segment aired that night at 6:00 p.m. Opened with drone footage over the peaceful lake, faded into a slow zoom on the empty dock where Brian's boat once sat, and cut to Brian holding up the altered form with his signature forged. Then came the check zoomed in with Chase's business name clearly visible. Karen's phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Half the neighborhood had already seen it before she even stepped out for her evening walk. Melanie, the compliance officer, canceled their weekend board meeting with no explanation, and two other board members resigned by noon the next day. But Karen wasn't the type to back off quietly. The very next morning, she knocked on Brian's door. Her visor was gone, her hair in disarray, and her usual smugness replaced with forced politeness. "I'd like to talk," she said without making eye contact. Brian didn't invite her in. She shifted uncomfortably. "This has gotten out of hand." Chase didn't understand the rules. He thought he was helping, and maybe I overstepped. But this could ruin a lot of reputations. "You mean yours?" Brian asked. Karen looked up, her eyes narrowing. "I've served this community for over 20 years. I've given everything to this HOA. And you took something that didn't belong to you," Brian said, "and then you covered it up with lies and forged paperwork." Her voice trembled slightly. "If you drop this, don't involve the county further, I can make it right." Quietly, "I'll see to it that your boat is returned. We'll clear your violation record. Wipe it clean." Brian folded his arms. "What about the funds? The check from the emergency account?" Karen froze. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You think you've won something? But people forget. These things blow over." Brian held her gaze. "Not this time." She stepped back, lips trembling, and walked off without another word. Later that evening, Brian received a copy of a subpoena issued to the Green Bend HOA. The fraud unit had opened a formal investigation. What began as a stolen boat was now a probe into misuse of funds, signature forgery, and internal corruption. The news broke again at 10 this time, with Karen's name in the headline. What no one expected was who came forward the next day. Because someone else had been watching this unfold from the inside, and they were ready to bring it all down. The neighborhood woke up differently that morning. Gone were the typical social media posts about landscaping or dog poop complaints. Every inbox in the Green Bend lakefront community had received a new message, this one not from the HOA board, but from a personal Gmail address. Subject line: "I can't keep quiet anymore." Melanie Griggs had broken ranks. The compliance officer who'd always stood quietly at Karen's side during meetings, who rubber-stamped citations and smiled politely at board barbecues, had just detonated a confession heard across the lake. Her message was blunt, typed in a single paragraph, but attached were 8 scanned documents, a voice recording, and a screen capture of the HOA internal portal, and they all told one story. The theft of Brian's boat had been planned weeks in advance and Melanie had been part of it. She explained everything. Karen had approached her in early spring about a special project. She claimed Brian had ignored several HOA requests, and that his boat was creating legal risk for the community. Karen said they could fast-track the removal if Melanie quietly signed a compliance form and backdated it. At first, Melanie resisted, but Karen offered her something no one else had: a seat on the executive board next year, with a guaranteed stipend. All Melanie had to do was sign a few papers and never ask about the boat again. Melanie had felt sick ever since. But when Brian stood in that clubhouse, calm and collected, holding proof in front of dozens of neighbors, her conscience finally snapped. The recording she sent was the final nail. It captured Karen speaking in her kitchen during a casual board dinner. Her voice was unmistakable. "Chase deserves that boat more than some guy who uses it twice a year. If Brian won't register it, it's fair game. Trust me, no one will question it once the paperwork's in." Brian sat on his porch with his phone in hand, reading Melanie's confession 3 times over. Then he checked the online community forum. Dozens of comments had already poured in. Most were stunned, a few were furious, but more than anything, people were finally realizing what Karen had done wasn't just questionable, it was calculated. By noon, 2 more board members publicly distanced themselves from her. A petition to hold a special vote of no confidence had already begun circulating. Brian didn't even have to ask for it. The neighbors were doing it on their own. Karen, however, wasn't gone yet. That evening, as Brian walked to the dock to check on the new chain he'd installed, a black SUV pulled up beside the Prescott house. Chase stepped out first, phone in hand, followed by Karen, who wore sunglasses even though the sun was nearly down. They didn't say a word as they entered their house, but something about the way Chase glanced over at Brian told him it wasn't over. At midnight, Brian's security cameras caught something. A figure in a hoodie tried to approach his boat slip again. This time, he was ready. The motion-activated floodlights snapped on. The figure froze, then sprinted off into the woods behind the Prescott property. Brian called it in, and a patrol car showed up 20 minutes later. But the real shock came. The next morning, Karen's home was quiet. Her car was gone. Chase's SUV too. A neighbor mentioned seeing them packing bags late the night before at 10 a.m. A deputy knocked on Brian's door. "Just a heads up," he said. "We've officially issued a notice of investigation." Funds were moved between HOA accounts illegally, and there's evidence of intent to defraud. Brian handed over the rest of his documentation, USPS, emails, the check stub, and Melanie's bombshell. The deputy nodded. This case just went federal. Brian watched him leave with quiet satisfaction. The wind off the lake felt different, now lighter. But even as Karen and Chase seemed to disappear, Brian knew something was still lurking. Because Karen hadn't just broken the rules, she'd exploited them. And the real twist was waiting in the water. Detective Ray Morgan hadn't expected to find himself pulled into a neighborly dispute over a boat. But when a 911 dispatcher flagged the bizarre transcript of Karen Palmer's hysterical call screaming he deserves it more, he knew there was more under the surface. That call had gone viral internally among local law enforcement. A woman demanding the police protect her son's right to a boat she didn't own. It didn't sit right. Especially not after Blake had shown up in person with documents proving legal ownership. That was the day the HOA's little power games stopped being petty and crossed into criminal. The detective visited Blake's property first. It was a modest lakeside home, peaceful, with the boat docked quietly at the pier. "It's not even about the boat anymore," Blake said flatly, pouring Ray a glass of lemonade. "It's about them thinking they can take anything, rewrite the rules mid-game, and gaslight you into believing they didn't." Meanwhile, Karen's son Troy had been spotted cruising the neighborhood earlier that week in a flashy truck with a mounted GoPro, narrating stories to his followers about his new boat and how power means claiming what you deserve. He was building an online persona off the theft, which only added fuel to Blake's fire. Detective Ray wasn't alone in watching those videos. Blake had also sent them to a few HOA members he knew were tired of Karen's antics. One clip in particular caught everyone's attention. Trey pointing to the camera, saying, "Yeah, Mom just walked in, gave me the keys, and said, 'You've earned it, baby.' That old guy doesn't even need a boat." Ray decided it was time to visit the HOA office. He didn't go in uniform. He didn't flash a badge. He just asked to see the incident logs and Karen's authority in assigning HOA assets. When told the HOA had no claim over the boat at all, Ray raised an eyebrow. So then she had no jurisdiction to gift it. The manager, Mr. Randall, went pale. She told us the boat was HOA property left on common ground. That's the only reason we didn't intervene. But the truth was documented. The boat had been on Blake's deeded slip, legally. Indisputably his. Tension rippled through the neighborhood. Residents began whispering about secret fines Karen had imposed, gifts she had handed out to her relatives, favors traded for silence. Someone anonymously posted screenshots of HOA invoices paid out to a company owned by Karen's cousin. One neighbor, elderly Mrs. Gibbons, confessed that Karen had pressured her into giving up part of her garden for beautification. That land was later paved and leased by Troy for party rentals. Blake felt like he was in the middle of a spiraling storm. But for the first time, he wasn't alone. Residents who had previously kept quiet started showing up on his doorstep with stories, receipts, and phone videos. It was as if someone had turned on the lights, and everyone was seeing the roaches scatter. Karen, however, seemed unaware. She walked the neighborhood like she owned it. She even dared to host a barbecue on HOA funds the weekend, inviting Troy to publicly show off the boat as the community's pride. But what she didn't know was that Blake had been recording everything, not just videos of her 911 call, Not just Trey's live streams, but also Karen's own emails, threatening language from HOA meetings, and conversations where she admitted she acted without board consent. That night, as Trey revved the boat engine, with an obnoxious roar, a sheriff's patrol car pulled up by the dock. Karen stepped forward, palms out. Is this about the noise? We're having a celebration. My son's boat, you know? He earned it, but the officer cut her off. Ma'am, I'm going to need to speak with your son. We've had a complaint. This boat was reported stolen and unlawfully transferred. Her smile faltered. But I'm the HOA president. That doesn't give you legal ownership of private property. Karen tried calling 911 again. Just like before, this time, the dispatcher responded, Ma'am, the detective already has everything he needs. I suggest you remain calm and cooperate. The crowd gathered, cell phones raised. Trey's expression went from smug to panicked. Karen stood frozen as the sheriff approached with handcuffs in hand, and as this neighborhood power trip spiraled into something far bigger. Blake stepped back and whispered to a neighbor, Now just wait till they hear what's in the accounting files. Karen Prescott stood on her porch like she was queen of the block. But inside her house, she was pacing nervously, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. She'd just learned that Noah Carter wasn't bluffing. He had filed a lawsuit, and not just any lawsuit. It included claims of theft, HOA fraud, civil conspiracy, and property damage, all with evidence, video, witnesses, GPS logs, even statements from her own HOA board, some of whom were now backing away from her completely. Noah, meanwhile, was calm. He didn't need to rant. He didn't need to scream. He had already won the neighborhood's quiet sympathy after Karen's stunt had gone public. What no one expected, though, was that Noah had one last card to play, and it was personal. It turned out that Karen's son, Kyle, the one who had ridden Noah's boat after it was illegally taken, was already on probation for a prior stolen vehicle incident from a nearby county. That incident had been quietly swept under the rug thanks to Karen pulling strings through an old HOA board member with legal connections. But now, Noah had looped in the district attorney from that county. Kyle was now facing real charges for a second offense. But Noah wasn't out for blood. He just wanted accountability. Still, it was too late for diplomacy. Karen was unraveling fast. At a surprise HOA emergency meeting called by board members who now feared legal exposure themselves, Karen showed up trying to act in control. She accused Noah of staging everything and even dared to say, My son deserves better than that old junky boat anyway. The room fell silent. Her mask cracked right there. Then it got worse. Noah's lawyer arrived with the sheriff's deputy. They handed Karen a court summons and noticed that the sheriff's department would be collecting the boat that day for evidence processing. Karen burst out screaming, grabbed her phone, and started yelling into 911 that she was being harassed, that he's threatening me, and that this is all a setup. But the dispatcher already knew the address. She calmly responded, Ma'am, you've made 8 calls this week. You are being recorded. Please cooperate with the deputy on site. Karen didn't listen. She tried to run inside, but the deputy blocked her. Kyle, watching from the window, disappeared from view. He knew it was over. The very next morning, he turned himself in, clearly advised by his attorney to minimize sentencing. As the dust settled, the sheriff's report went public. So did HOA documents showing Karen had misused neighborhood funds to pay for HOA maintenance that actually covered work on her own property. She'd even billed the HOA for private security during her boat scheme, calling it community safety. The final HOA meeting 2 weeks later was standing room only. Karen tried to bar Noah from speaking, but the board under pressure and possible dissolution gave him the floor. Noah didn't rant. He showed pictures of the boat's damage, quoted the HOA charter that had been violated, and presented copies of receipts, emails, and timestamps. By the time he finished, the board quietly passed a motion to expel Karen from her role. The vote was unanimous. Even her own former allies backed it. Karen didn't even stay to hear it. She walked out halfway through Noah's speech. A month later, she moved out. But the story didn't end there. With Karen gone and the HOA reorganizing under new leadership, Noah was elected to the advisory board not because he wanted revenge, but because he had proven he could stand up to abuse of power. The boat, he sold it. The money went into setting up a small community legal defense fund for neighbors who got wrongly fined or targeted because, as he told the local paper, nobody else should have to fight a war just to keep what's already theirs. And just when everyone thought it was all behind them, a year later, Karen's mugshot hit the news. She'd been charged in another county for HOA fraud tied to a property she tried to manage in her sister's name. Apparently, old habits die hard. Noah didn't gloat. He just went fishing, this time on a rented boat with peace in the air and not a Karen in sight.